Welcome back to the Peony Patterns YouTube channel. My name is Ashley and I am the sew along host here at Peony Patterns. Today we are going to be sewing the Edelweiss dress together. Edelweiss is an enchanting dress with two colour options, either a narrow or a wide scalloped or Peter Pan style collar for that vintage charm. Edelweiss offers three different sleeve options: a statement reverse Juliet sleeve, or a long or short simple sleeve with a sweet cuff finish. The skirt can be sewn in either a vintage or mini length, with the option of adding a charming underskirt for extra volume. If you haven't yet purchased your copy of the Edelweiss pattern, I will pop a link in the description box below where you can go ahead and purchase that, ready to begin sewing. We are now going to jump straight in and see all of the pattern pieces that I have cut and prepared for my two Edelweiss dresses that I will be sewing throughout the sew along to show all the different variations that are available within the pattern. Then we will begin sewing. For my first Edelweiss, I'm going to be making a short cuffed sleeve version with the optional Peter Pan collar. So to start off with, I have two skirt pieces cut. You can either choose the mini or the vintage length, and you can also choose to add a underskirt if you wish. For this particular Edelweiss, I have chosen to not add the underskirt. So I have just cut two skirt pieces in my main fabric. Then I have four back bodice pieces cut. Two of those are in my main fabric, the other two are in my lining, and they are cut as a mirror image set of each other. I then have my front bodice pieces cut. I have one of those in my main fabric and the other is in my lining fabric, and that particular pattern piece is cut on the fold. I then have two sleeve pieces cut. As I mentioned, this one here is going to have the short cuffed sleeves. So I have cut two short sleeve pieces out, but you do have the choice for the cuffed sleeve to cut either the short or the long length. And the sleeve pattern piece is cut on the fold as well. Then I have two sleeve cuff pieces cut. Now, as I'm making the short sleeve, I have cut those at the short sleeve length. If you are making the long sleeve, then you will cut those using the long sleeve cuff piece. I also have my skirt placket, as well as my four collar pieces. So I've chosen to cut all of those in my main fabric, but you will need two main and two lining. So the collar is optional and you can either cut a Peter Pan collar or a scalloped collar. For this particular Edelweiss, I have chosen to cut the Peter Pan collar. So I have four of those as two mirror image sets of each other. And then finally, I have my two pieces of interfacing cut for my collar. So they are also cut as a mirror image set of each other. Now here are all of the pattern pieces cut for my second Edelweiss dress. Now this one here is going to have the optional scalloped collar, sash, the reverse Juliet sleeves, and the underskirt. So to start off with, I have my two front bodice pieces cut. They are both cut on the fold, and I have one of those in my main fabric and the other in my lining. I then have four back bodice pieces cut. Two of those are in my main fabric and the other two are in my lining fabric, and they are cut as a mirror image set of each other. Then I have two mirror image sets cut of my scalloped collar. So I've chosen to cut all of those in my main fabric, but you will need two main and two lining. Then I have also cut my two scalloped collar interfacing pieces as a mirror image set. For the optional sash, I have four sash pieces cut. They are cut as two mirror image sets of each other. Moving on to the sleeves, as I mentioned, I'm making the reverse Juliet sleeves for this one. So I have two upper reverse Juliet sleeve pieces cut. They are cut on the fold. Then I have two lower reverse Juliet sleeve pieces cut. They are also cut on the fold. Then I have two pieces of elastic cut here for the reverse Juliet sleeves. The cutting chart for the elastic is provided on page 17 of the Edelweiss pattern. Then for the skirt, as I mentioned, this one here is going to have the optional underskirt. So I have 2 main skirt pieces cut, plus my 10 underskirt pieces. Then I also have my skirt placket up here as well. So that is all of the pattern pieces that I have cut and prepared for my 2 Edelweiss dresses. I'm looking forward to seeing all of the fabrics you've chosen and all of your pattern pieces cut. Then we will begin sewing tomorrow. Now, prior to beginning the construction of our Edelweiss dresses, the first step is optional, but is definitely recommended, and that is to stabilize the back buttonhole area on your left back bodice lining piece by adhering a strip of fusible interfacing. So I have my left back bodice lining piece here with the wrong side facing up, and I also have a strip of fusible interfacing cut that is 1.5 inches in width, and so that it will fit with 1/2 inch to spare at the bottom and 1/2 inch to spare at the top neckline of my bodice as well. I'm also going to position it 1/2 inch away from the center back raw edge there, and then I'm going to press that in place. Once you have then adhered the fusible interfacing to your left back bodice lining piece, we can now pop that aside and begin the construction of our Edelweiss dresses. Now, to begin the construction of our Edelweiss dresses, we are firstly going to be working on the collars. Now, for the purpose of the tutorial, I'm going to be showing this being done on the scalloped collar, but the instructions are the exact same whether you are making the scalloped or the Peter Pan collar. So firstly, we are going to take our 2 collar lining pieces as well as our 2 collar interfacing pieces. Now, taking one of our collar interfacing pieces, we are going to be placing that on top of the wrong side of our lining piece, and we are going to be placing that so that it is 1/4 inch away from the outer curved raw edge and 1/2 inch from the inner curved edge, and then repeat that for our remaining collar lining piece and our second collar interfacing piece. Then we are going to press the interfacing in place to the wrong side of our collar lining pieces. Once you've finished adhering your collar interfacing in place to the wrong side of your lining pieces, now we are going to pop one of those aside. Now, taking the collar lining piece that we are firstly going to be working with, we're going to flip it over so that we're looking at the right side of that collar lining, and then locate the corresponding main collar piece that we are now going to place on top, right sides together. Making sure that when you are placing this on top, you are taking note of the position of the front of the collar and also the shoulder notch on both collar pieces. You also want to align the inner curved neckline and also the outer curved edge as well. Once you have those placed right sides together and all of those raw edges are aligned, and you've also aligned the shoulder notch, we are then going to pin around the outer curved edge. If you are making the Peter Pan collar, it's going to be the exact same process. So I have my collar lining piece here facing right sides up towards me. We're then going to take our main collar piece, place it right sides together with our collar lining, aligning all of those raw edges, the shoulder seam, and also making sure that we're taking note of the placement of the front of the collar. Once we have that aligned, we are then going to pin around the outer curved edge as well. Once pinned, regardless of what collar you have chosen to sew, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using 1/4 inch seam allowance to now stitch around the outer curved edges where we have pinned. You may also find it helpful at this stage to shorten your stitch length on your sewing machine to help create a really smooth curve. Once sewn, we are now going to clip the curves around the outer raw edge where we have sewn. If you are making the scallop collar, we're going to very carefully cut out a triangular notch at each V point along that outer raw curve, as close to the seam as possible, but making sure to not cut through the stitching. So once you complete that step, this is now what your scalloped collar will look like. We are then going to continue by clipping the outer edge, being careful not to clip through any of that stitching. Alternatively, pinking shears can be used. If you have sewn the Peter Pan collar, you will now simply clip the curve around that raw outer edge, or alternatively, again, use pinking shears. We can then go ahead and turn our collars out the right way. A quick tip when turning your collar out is you can use a chopstick or something similar along those seams to help gently smooth out all of those curves. Then we are going to press, gently smoothing and shaping out those curved edges. Once pressed, the next step is optional, but that is to go ahead and top stitch around the outer curved edges using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then we can go ahead and repeat those exact same steps for our remaining collar pieces. Once you have then finished repeating those exact same steps for your second collar pieces, we can now pop those aside. Now we are going to begin the construction of the optional sash. If you have chosen to not add the sash to your Edelweiss dress, you can simply skip this section by using the timestamps below. For those of you who are sticking around though and watching the construction of the sash, we are going to start by taking one of our sash pieces and placing that right sides facing up. Then we are going to place the corresponding sash piece on top so that they are right sides together, aligning those raw edges. Then we are going to pin in place along the top and bottom straight raw edges and also along the raw angled end as well. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we will sew along the top and bottom straight raw edges and also that short angled raw edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Making sure to not sew along the short raw end. Once sewn, we are then going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch and clip the corners of the sash so that it sits nicely when turned right side out, making sure that when we are doing this we are really careful to not cut through any of the stitching. Alternatively, pinking shears can be used at this stage. Once we've then trimmed the seam allowance down, we are then going to also carefully taper each side of the angled points to 1/8 inch, being careful to not clip through any of that stitching at all. Once you have done that, this is then what the corners will look like. So they will just be tapered down to help reduce that bulk when turning those out the right way. Then we are going to take our sash and turn it right side out. So I'm just using a turning tool to help do that. Then we are going to carefully push out those corners at the end of the sash, so I am just using a blunt pencil to do that. Now that our sash is turned out the right way and we have pushed those corners out, now we are going to press the sash. Once pressed, we are then going to top stitch along the top and bottom straight ends and also that short angled edge as well, using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have then finished top stitching around those edges, now we are going to locate the raw short end of the sash, and we are going to press the end of the sash in half lengthwise, right sides together, to now create a fold in the center for the pleat. Once pressed, we are then going to find the halfway point between the folded and the top stitched edges, and using a removable sewing marker, we are going to draw a 1.5 inch horizontal line across the sash at this halfway point, starting at the raw edge. So this is now what that step will look like. So you can see that I've drawn a horizontal line that is 1.5 inches in length along the halfway point there between the folded edge and the top stitched edge. Now, to create the pleat, we are going to sew along that line, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once sewn, we are then going to unfold the sash and place it wrong sides facing up. We are then going to take the pleat and open it flat. Then we are going to press that, ensuring that the pleat is centered over the stitch line underneath. Now, when we flip our sash over to look at it from the right side of the fabric, this is now what it will look like. Now we are going to repeat all of those exact same steps with our remaining sash pieces to create a mirror image pair. Once you have then repeated those exact same steps on your remaining sash pieces, now creating a mirror image pair of each other, we can now pop those aside. Now we are going to begin the construction of our bodices. So I have my front bodice main piece here facing right sides up towards me. I'm then going to take one of my back bodice main pieces and align that with the corresponding shoulder. Once you have that then aligned with the corresponding shoulder and right sides together, we are now going to pin those in place. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned along those shoulder raw edges using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you have then finished attaching one of your back bodice main pieces to your front bodice main, we are now going to repeat that exact same step for our remaining back bodice piece. So placing it right sides together with our front bodice and aligning it at the corresponding shoulder and pinning. Then we can head to the sewing machine to attach those using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then once sewn, we can open our bodice up and then press both of those shoulder seams open. And then once we've pressed those shoulder seams open, we can now pop our bodice main aside and now repeat those exact same steps for our bodice lining pieces. So I have my front bodice lining piece here, right sides up. I'm now going to take one of my back bodice lining pieces, placing it right sides together and aligning it at the corresponding shoulder. Once we've then pinned those in place, we can now head to the sewing machine to attach those using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once we have then attached one of our back bodice pieces, we can then do the same for our remaining back bodice lining piece. Now I'm going to head to the sewing machine to sew and attach my remaining back bodice lining piece to my front bodice lining along that shoulder raw edge. Once you've now repeated those exact same steps for your bodice lining pieces, we can now continue by opening our bodice up and pressing those shoulder seams open. Then we can pop our lining pieces aside. Now we are going to be attaching our collar. If you have chosen to not add a collar to your Edelweiss dress, you can simply skip this section of the tutorial using the timestamps down below. But for those of you who are following along and have chosen to add a collar to your Edelweiss dress, we are now going to be adding that. So I have my main bodice pieces here, my front main bodice piece and my two back main bodice pieces, and I have got that facing right sides up towards me. Now at this stage, before proceeding, you do want to make sure that you have the center front point of the neckline marked with either an erasable pen or a pin along the raw edge of your neckline. And then we are also going to be measuring in 1¼ inches from the center back raw edge of one of our back bodice pieces along the top raw edge of our neckline and placing a mark using an erasable pen at that point. And then repeating that for our second back bodice piece as well. So once you have then measured in 1¼ inches from the center back raw edge and you've placed that mark on both back bodice pieces, then we are going to lay our bodice back out flat like so. Now for the purposes of the tutorial, I am going to be showing the following steps with the scalloped collar. However, the instructions will be the exact same whether you are using the scalloped or the Peter Pan collar. Now taking one of our previously prepared set of collars, we are going to be attaching that to our bodice, making sure that when we are doing this, we are aligning the raw inner curved edge of our collar with the raw edge of our neckline. We are also going to be placing it so that the collar lining is touching the right side of our bodice main. Now when attaching our collar, we want to make sure that the shoulder notch on our collar aligns with the shoulder seam in our bodice. The front edge of our collar aligns with the center front point marked on our front bodice piece. And then finally, the back of the collar will align with the mark that we have just created in the previous step on our back bodice pieces. So I'm going to go ahead now and pin my collar to my bodice main. Once you've then finished gently easing your collar around your neckline and you've pinned it in place, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we will base the collar in place using 1/4 inch seam allowance, ensuring that the front of the collar lines up perfectly with the center front of the neckline. Once you have then basted your collar in place, we are then going to repeat the exact same steps for our remaining collar on the opposite side of our bodice. Once you've then finished pinning your second collar in place, before proceeding, you do want to make sure that the collars align directly in the center of your front bodice along the center front point that we've marked previously. If they aren't meeting directly in the center at this step, you can then go ahead and adjust that. Once you have that perfectly meeting in the center, we can now go ahead and baste our second collar in place, once again using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you have then finished basting your second collar piece in place, now we are going to attach the optional sash. If you have, however, chosen to not add the sash to your Edelweiss dress, you can simply skip the next section of the tutorial using the timestamps down below. Now, to attach the optional sash, we are going to start by having our bodice main right sides facing up. So I have my front bodice separated away from my back bodice pieces, which are up here. Now on one side of the front bodice main, we are going to measure 3/4 inch up from this bottom raw edge, and we are going to place a mark using either a pin or an erasable sewing marker along the raw side edge. Then we are going to repeat that for the opposite side as well. Now we are going to locate the corresponding sash piece and place it on the left side of the front bodice main, right sides together. Make sure that the bottom of your sash aligns with the 3/4 inch mark that we have just created. The wrong side of the sash, which has the box or raised side of the pleat, will be facing up towards us, and we are going to match the short raw end of the sash with the raw edge of our bodice. Before proceeding, you do want to make sure that you have the correct sash in place and that it is positioned correctly so that the sharp angled point of the sash is facing downwards. Once you have checked that and you have your sash aligned with the side raw edge and you've also got it aligned with that mark that we created earlier, then you can go ahead and pin that in place. Then we are going to head back to the sewing machine where we will baste that in place using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have then basted your sash piece in place along the left hand side of your front bodice main, we are going to pop that out of the way and then repeat that step for the remaining sash piece on the opposite side of our front bodice main. Once you have then basted your second sash in place, then we are now ready to complete our bodice. Now, to complete our bodice, the following steps will be shown with my bodice with the scalloped collar and also the optional sash. However, the instructions will be the same for all bodice options. So now, starting with our bodice main, right sides facing up, I've also separated my back bodices away from my front bodice here. We are then going to take our bodice lining and place it right sides together with our bodice main. We are then going to pin those together up the center backs and around the neckline, making sure to align all of the raw edges and the shoulder seams as we go. Now, if the optional collar has been added, that will now be being sandwiched in between both of our bodice main and bodice lining fabrics. Once you have then pinned your bodice lining to your bodice main, up the center backs and around the neckline, making sure that you have also aligned the shoulder seams. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine where we will sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you have added the optional sash, you do want to make sure that that is just kept out of the way as you are sewing this seam. Once you have then finished sewing around the neckline and those center backs to now attach your bodice lining to your bodice main, it is recommended to now check if the optional collar was added, that it is sitting correctly at the neckline with no visible gap or any overlapping. So if there is any gap or any overlapping, you can now adjust that at this stage before proceeding. Once you're then happy with how the collar is sitting, we are then going to move on to clip the corners and also the curves. We are also going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, or alternatively pinking shears can be used. So I'm going to start off by clipping the corners. Now I'm going to use a pair of pinking shears to trim that seam allowance down. However, you can go ahead and simply just trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch and then clip the curves. Once you have then finished clipping those corners and you've also trimmed your seam allowance and have clipped the curves around the neckline there, we are now going to separate our bodice main and lining apart, and we are going to understitch the entire neckline seam allowance to the bodice lining using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So we are going to begin sewing at one of the center backs as close to the corner as possible. We are then going to sew around the entire neckline until we reach the opposite center back. I'm going to go ahead and do this step now, then we'll come back to show you exactly what that will look like. So once you have gone ahead and understitched the entire neckline seam allowance towards the lining, this is now what that will look like. And then from the wrong side, it simply just tacks the seam allowance towards your bodice lining. Now we are going to move on and turn our bodice out the right way and gently just push out the corners. So I'm just going to use a blunt pencil to do that. So once you have gone ahead and understitched the entire neckline seam allowance towards the lining, this is now what that will look like. And then from the wrong side, it simply just tacks the seam allowance towards your bodice lining. Now we are going to move on and turn our bodice out the right way and gently just push out the corners. So I'm just going to use a blunt pencil to do that. Once we have it turned out the right way, then we can go ahead and give our bodice a press. Once you have now pressed your bodice, we are going to make sure that our bodice is opened out. So we have our front bodice separated from our two back bodices. And we are going to be placing it so that the right side is facing up towards us again. Now on one of our back bodices, we are going to separate the main and the lining apart so that we are looking at the right side of our main fabric as well as the right side of our lining. We are also going to do the exact same for our front bodice. So we are going to separate our main away from our lining. So we now have our front bodice main and then our front bodice lining, both right sides up as well. We are then going to flip our front bodice main over towards our back bodice main so that they are right sides together. We are going to align those short raw side edges and pin in place. Now, if the sash has been added, that is going to be sandwiched in between the two main fabrics. Now we are going to take the front bodice lining as well as our back bodice lining and do the exact same thing with them. So I have my right side of my back bodice lining here, and this is the right side of my front bodice lining on the same side. We are going to place those right sides together, aligning those short raw side edges and pin. Now that we have those two sets of side raw edges pinned, we are going to repeat those steps on the opposite side. So once again, we are going to separate our back bodice main away from our back bodice lining so that we are looking at the right sides of each of those fabrics. And then our front bodice main is here and our front bodice lining is here, both again right sides facing up towards us. We are then going to flip our front bodice main over towards our back bodice main, right sides together, aligning those short raw side edges and pinning. And then repeating that for our remaining bodice lining pieces. So making sure that they are once again right sides together. Now that we have all four side seams pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we will sew each of those using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, if you have added the sash, that will now be sandwiched in between as you sew your main front bodice and main back bodice pieces together. Once sewn, we are then going to go ahead and press all four of those seams open. Then turn the bodice right side out. Once you have then turned your bodice out the right way, the next step is optional, and that is to baste the main and lining fabrics together at the arm's eye. So if you would like to go ahead with this step, we are simply going to align the shoulder seams and also the side seams, and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we will baste the two fabrics together, making sure that if the optional collar and or sash was added, that they are kept out of the way when doing this step. I will go ahead and baste my arm's eyes, then we'll come back to show you what that will look like if you do decide to go ahead with that step. So if you have decided to go ahead with the step of basting your main and lining fabrics together around the arm's eye, this is now what that will look like. So it's just a simple basting stitch that will now hold those two fabrics together in preparation for our sleeves to be added. So this is my bodice with the optional scalloped collar and also the optional sash added. And here is my bodice with the optional Peter Pan collar. Now we are going to be constructing the Edelweiss simple sleeves and sleeve cuffs. If you are joining in and making the reverse Juliet sleeves, you can simply skip ahead to the construction of those using the timestamps down below. But for those of you who are joining in and making the simple sleeves with the sleeve cuffs, we are now going to be constructing those. For the purposes of the tutorial, I'm going to be showing the short sleeves only. However, the instructions are the exact same for both simple sleeve options. So firstly, we are going to be working on our sleeve cuffs. I'm going to be working on only one to start off with. So here is one of my sleeve cuffs for my simple sleeve. So to start off with, we are going to be folding one of the sleeve cuff pieces in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and we are going to press to create a memory crease. Once that is pressed, we are going to unfold, where we can now see the memory crease down the center of that sleeve cuff. Now we are going to fold the longer raw outer edges in towards that center crease, wrong sides together, and press those in as well. Once we have now folded both of those outer raw edges in towards that center memory crease, we are now going to fold the fabric in half again, lengthwise along that center memory crease, and press to now create a sharp crease. Now we are going to unfold the sleeve cuff piece and fold it now in half widthwise, right sides together, aligning the short raw ends and also the memory creases, and we are going to pin that in place. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew along this short raw end using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you have then sewn both short raw ends of your cuff together, now we are going to press that seam open, being careful to not remove any of those memory creases that we've just created when doing so. Next, we are going to turn our cuff right side out, and then we are going to find the center point of the sleeve cuff opposite the seam, using either a pin or an air erasable sewing marker along the bottom raw edge. So I personally like to just fold my sleeve cuff in half, and here is that seam at the very edge there, and then find the opposite point, which is then my center point. Just pop a pin in there. And as you can see, that has now marked the center point along that bottom raw edge, which is now opposite from that seam that we've just created. Once you've done that, you can then go ahead and complete those exact same steps for your second sleeve cuff. Once you have then repeated those same steps for your second sleeve cuff, we can now pop those both aside. Now locating one of our sleeve pieces, we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of the sleeve piece between the notches. We are going to be sewing the first row of gathering stitches 1/4 inch from the top raw edge, and then the second row will be 3/8 inch away from that first line of gathering stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my 2 rows of gathering stitches now between those notches, then we'll be back with the next steps. Once you have then sewn your 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of your sleeve between those notches, now we are going to fold the sleeve piece in half widthwise, right sides together, aligning the raw side edges and pinning in place. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew where we've pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, we are also going to finish off this raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished sewing that seam and you've also finished off the raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, we are then going to turn our sleeve out the right way. Now that our sleeve is turned right side out, we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches again, but this time they are going to be along this bottom raw edge of our sleeve, starting at one side of the sleeve side seam and then sewing around and finishing at the other side. The first row is going to be 1/4 inch away from the bottom raw edge. The second row will then be 3/8 inch away from the first line of stitching. So I'm going to go ahead to now complete my 2 rows of gathering stitches along the entire bottom raw edge of my sleeve. Once you've then sewn your 2 rows of gathering stitches along the entire bottom raw edge of your sleeve, next we are going to mark the center point of the sleeve along the bottom raw edge, and that is going to be opposite the sleeve side seam. So we are going to mark that with either a pin or an air erasable marker. So once again, I just like to fold my sleeve in half at the side seam and then find my center point from there. And I'll just use a pin to mark that. Now that we've found the center point of our sleeve, now we are going to repeat all of those steps for our second sleeve piece as well. Once you've then repeated those steps and completed your second sleeve, now we are going to be attaching our cuffs. Now we're going to be working on just one sleeve at a time, so I have one of my sleeve pieces here as well as one of my sleeve cuff pieces. Now we are going to be gathering the bottom edge of our sleeve to be the same width as our sleeve cuff. Once you've then gathered the bottom edge of your sleeve to be the same width as your sleeve cuff, we are now going to carefully slide the unfolded sleeve cuff inside of the sleeve, aligning this bottom raw edge of the sleeve cuff with the bottom raw edge of the sleeve. The correct side of the sleeve cuff will now be touching the wrong side of the sleeve. So I'm going to place mine inside. And so as you can see, the right side of my sleeve cuff is now facing the wrong side of my sleeve. I'm then also going to align the seam of the sleeve cuff to the seam of my sleeve and pin. Now you can go ahead and remove one of those center point pins and just pin through both layers of fabric at that center point. Then we are going to continue pinning the bottom raw edge of the sleeve to the sleeve cuff, distributing those gathers evenly in between. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach our sleeve cuff to our sleeve. Now the line of stitching should align with the memory crease that is closest to the bottom raw edge of the sleeve cuff and the sleeve. So I'm going to go ahead now and attach my sleeve cuff to my sleeve, then we'll be back with the next steps. Once you have then finished sewing your sleeve cuff to the bottom raw edge of your sleeve, you can then go ahead and remove any visible gathering stitches. Then we are going to carefully trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. Next, we are going to pull the sleeve cuff down and press that seam allowance now down towards the sleeve cuff, being careful to not accidentally remove the existing memory creases in our cuff. Next, we are going to refold the first memory crease, that is the one that is closest to the raw edge of our sleeve cuff, and press. Next, we are then going to refold the sleeve cuff along the center memory crease, bringing the folded edge of the sleeve cuff now up over the sleeve gathers, enclosing this raw edge of the bottom of our sleeve. The folded edge of the sleeve cuff should then be covering the seam sewn previously, attaching the sleeve cuff to the sleeve. Once you have then folded your sleeve cuff up in position, enclosing those raw edges, you can now go ahead and press and pin that in place. Alternatively though, fabric glue or hem tape can be used to assist in keeping the sleeve cuff up in the correct position. So personally, I like to use fabric glue in instances like this. So I have gone ahead and used fabric glue to now hold that cuff up in place so that it is covering the stitch line of where the sleeve cuff is attached to the sleeve. So that is now held up in place. As I mentioned, you can use pins though. So once you've either use fabric glue or hem tape or pins to hold your sleeve cuff in place, then we are going to go ahead and top stitch the folded edge of the sleeve cuff to the sleeve using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now, a quick tip at this stage, especially for smaller sizes which can be a bit more fiddly, and the longer sleeves with a smaller size cuff, it can be helpful to turn your sleeve inside out and place the needle inside of the sleeve, sewing from the inside out, so sewing from the right side of the sleeve and going around. That will just make it a bit easier and less fiddly when it comes to top stitching. So I'm going to go ahead now and top stitch the sleeve cuff to the sleeve, and we'll be back with the next steps. Once you have then finished top stitching along the folded edge of the cuff, this is now what your sleeve will look like. So now you can go ahead and remove any visible gathering stitches. Then we are going to mark the center point of the sleeve cap using either a pin or a removable sewing marker. So to find the center, we are simply going to fold our sleeve in half widthwise at the side seam, and then find the center point, and I've just marked mine with a pin. Now with the sleeve right side out, we are going to gather the sleeve cap, leaving the tails of the gathering threads still long so that the sleeve can be further adjusted when set into the bodice. So that is now one of our sleeves complete. We are now going to repeat all of those same steps for our second sleeve. Once you have repeated those steps for your second sleeve and sleeve cuff, now you are looking at your completed simple sleeves, now ready to be attached to your bodice. I'm going to now continue on with the construction of the reverse Juliet sleeves, but if you would like to skip that and skip straight to attaching your sleeves, you can do so using the timestamps down below. Now to begin the construction of the reverse Juliet sleeves, we are firstly going to be working with the reverse Juliet lower sleeve pieces. So I have one of mine here, and I'm going to finish off the straight bottom raw edge of that using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, being careful to not trim off any of that fabric whilst doing so. Once you have then finished that bottom raw edge, now we are going to fold the bottom finished edge of the lower sleeve piece up towards the wrong side of the fabric by 5/8 of an inch. So I have just flipped mine around to work with it upside down, but this is now the bottom edge that we have just finished. So I'm now going to fold that up by 5/8 of an inch and press towards the wrong side of my fabric. Once pressed, we are now going to unfold that to now create a memory crease. Now placing our lower sleeve piece facing right sides up and the memory crease unfolded, we are now going to fold that lower sleeve piece in half widthwise, right sides together, ensuring that the memory crease remains unfolded, and we are going to align the raw side edges and the memory crease and pin in place. Once pinned, we can now head to the sewing machine to sew along that side raw edge. Now using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then we can also finish off the raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished sewing and you've also finished off that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then we are going to turn the lower sleeve piece right side out. And we are now going to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches around the circumference of the top raw edge of our lower sleeve piece, starting on one side of the sleeve side seam and sewing all the way around and finishing on the other side. We are going to be sewing the first row of gathering stitches 1/4 of an inch away from the top raw edge, then the second row will be 3/8 of an inch away from that first line of stitching. So I'm going to go ahead now and complete my 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge, then we'll be back. Once you've then finished sewing your 2 rows of gathering stitches along that top raw edge, then we are going to mark the center point, which is going to be opposite to the seam. So using either a pin or an air erasable marker, I'm going to simply find the center point opposite the seam in our sleeve and place a pin in there to mark that point. Now we are going to repeat those steps for our second lower sleeve piece. Once you have repeated those exact same steps for your second lower sleeve piece, now we can pop those aside. Now we are going to be working with our reverse Juliet upper sleeve piece. So I have one of my upper sleeve pieces here, and to start off with, we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of our sleeve. Between the notches, the first row of gathering stitches will be 1/4 of an inch from the top raw edge, then the second row will be 3/8 of an inch away from that first row of stitching. So I'm going to go ahead now to complete my 2 rows of gathering stitches between those notches, then we'll be back. Now we are going to fold the upper sleeve piece in half widthwise, right sides together, aligning the raw straight side edges, and we are going to pin those together. Then once pinned, we can head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew along that straight raw edge where we've pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we can also finish that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have finished sewing to create now your sleeve side seam, and you've also finished that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then we are going to turn our upper sleeve piece right side out. And we are now going to find and mark the center point of the upper sleeve along the bottom raw edge. So that is going to be the point opposite our sleeve seam. And you can use a pin or an air erasable marker to mark that point. Now we are going to locate one of the lower sleeves that we created earlier, and we are going to turn it wrong side out. Then we can gather the top raw edge of our lower sleeve piece to be the same width as the bottom raw edge of our upper sleeve. Once you've then finished gathering your lower sleeve piece to be the same width as the bottom raw edge of your upper sleeve piece, then with the upper sleeve piece right sides out, we are going to slide the lower sleeve over the end of the upper sleeve, right sides together. So we've now inserted our upper sleeve inside of our lower sleeve piece, right sides together. We can now align and pin at those center points and also align the sleeve seams and pin there as well. And it's also important at this stage to make sure that the seam allowances are nested in opposite directions. So as you can see on my lower sleeve piece here, the seam allowance is going to the left, and on my upper sleeve piece it is going to the right. So that will just reduce some bulkiness at the seam there. Now we are going to continue by aligning the upper raw edge of our lower sleeve piece to the lower raw edge of our upper sleeve piece, and we are going to do that by continuing to distribute those gathers evenly in between the points we have pinned and continue pinning in place. Once you have then finished distributing those gathers evenly and you've continued to pin your lower sleeve piece to your upper sleeve piece, right sides together, now we are going to head to the sewing machine where we can now sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we are also going to finish off that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Then once you have finished attaching your lower sleeve piece to your upper sleeve piece and you've also finished off that raw edge, then we are going to open our sleeve out the right way. We are then going to press that seam allowance now up towards the upper sleeve piece. Then you can also go ahead and remove any visible gathering stitches. Now turning our sleeve wrong side out, we are now going to refold that memory crease that we created earlier on the lower sleeve, and we are going to pin that in place. Once pinned, we are now going to head back to the sewing machine where we can now edge stitch that in place to create a casing for our elastic. So we are going to be leaving approximately a 1 inch opening to thread our elastic through shortly. Once you have then created your casing for your elastic with approximately a 1 inch gap to thread your elastic through, we can now go ahead and thread our elastic. So we are going to start by threading it through the casing, making sure that you do not continue to pull the end of elastic through. So I just like to put a pin in once it gets close to the opening to stop it from coming through as well, and then continue threading. Now check to make sure that your elastic has not twisted at all as it's been threaded. Then we are going to overlap the ends of elastic by approximately 1/2 inch and pin. Now we can head to the sewing machine where we are going to stitch the two ends of elastic together using a zigzag stitch. Once you have then stitched the two ends of elastic together, then we can gently stretch the sleeve opening out just slightly to allow the elastic to move inside of that casing. Then we can sew that 1 inch opening closed. Once you have then sewn the opening closed, we can now stretch out the sleeve opening to allow the elastic to be evenly distributed within the casing. Now we are going to turn our sleeve out the right way, and we are going to mark the center point of the sleeve cap using either a pin or an air erasable marker. Now with the sleeve remaining right sides out, we are going to gather the sleeve cap making sure to leave the tails of the gathering threads long so that the sleeve can be further adjusted when set into the bodice. So now that we have gathered the sleeve cap, it is now time to repeat those same steps for our second reverse Juliet sleeve. Once you have then repeated those same steps for your second sleeve pieces, you now have your 2 complete reverse Juliet sleeves that are now ready to attach to your bodice. Now we are going to move on to attaching the sleeves to our bodices. For the purposes of the tutorial, I'm going to be showing this using the reverse Juliet sleeves, as well as my bodice with the optional scalloped collar and the sash. However, the instructions will be the same for all versions. So firstly, we are going to take our bodice and turn it wrong sides out. Now, keeping the sleeve right side out, we are going to insert the sleeve into the bodice to meet the arm opening, and the right side of our sleeve fabric will be facing the right side of our bodice. Now, if the optional collar has been added, you will need to move that out of the way, and just also keep an eye on the sash if you have added that, and make sure that they are kept out of the way as well. Now we want to align the raw edges of our sleeve to the raw edges of the arm's eye. And I like to begin by firstly aligning the center point of our sleeve, which is where the pin is, to the shoulder seam on our bodice and pinning. And then aligning the sleeve seam to the side seam on my bodice and pinning there as well. Now I'm going to continue to pin the sleeve to the bodice from the underarm, working my way up. And I pin until I reach those gathering stitches. So once I have pinned the sleeve in place up until the gathering stitches on either side of the sleeve, I'm now going to continue by distributing those gathers evenly and pinning those in place as well. Once you have then finished distributing those gathers evenly and you've pinned the remainder of your sleeve in place, now is a great time to make sure that the optional collar or sash has not accidentally been pinned before proceeding. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we can also finish that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished attaching your sleeve to your bodice and you've also finished that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then we are now going to repeat those steps for our second sleeve. Once you have then repeated those same steps and added your second sleeve, we are then going to turn our bodice out the right way and give it a press. Now, a quick optional tip at this step is to lift the collar out of the way and tack the seam that we've just created by attaching the sleeve to the arm's eye now towards your bodice by stitching in the ditch of the shoulder seam. So if you decide to go ahead with that step, you can simply just fold your seam allowance towards your bodice and just tack a few stitches in the ditch of that seam to hold that seam in place. Then the next step is optional, and that is to baste the bodice main and lining together around the entire bottom raw edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If the optional sash was added, just make sure that that is kept out of the way when doing that step if you do decide to go ahead with that. Now, if you have decided to go ahead with that optional step of basting your main and lining fabrics together along the bottom raw edge, then that will now just hold those two fabrics together along that bottom raw edge. Now we are going to create our buttonholes. So alternatively, snaps can be used if you prefer, or if you would prefer to wait and create your buttonholes when the dress is completed, you can definitely do that as well. It is personal preference, however, adding them now can avoid the buttonhole foot becoming caught on the waist seam when the skirt is attached. So for Edelweiss, we are going to be creating 3 to 5 vertical buttonholes on the left hand side of the back bodice. The buttonhole should be placed evenly 3/8 of an inch away from the center back here. Then the first buttonhole should be placed approximately 1/4 of an inch from the top of the bodice, and the bottom buttonhole will be 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch from this bottom raw edge. So I'm going to go ahead now and mark out my buttonholes. So I've just gone ahead and marked out the placement for my 3 vertical buttonholes. As I mentioned, it is recommended to add between 3 and 4 buttonholes depending on what size you are making. So I've placed the first one 1/4 of an inch from the top of my bodice, and the bottom one, it is recommended to place 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch from the bottom raw edge. So I've placed mine 1 inch up from the bottom raw edge, and then I have evenly distributed the third buttonhole in between those two. So I'm now going to go ahead to my sewing machine and create my buttonholes. So I've just gone ahead and created my vertical buttonholes on my left back bodice piece. So this is now what your bodice will look like at this stage. So this is my bodice with the optional scalloped collar, sash, and also the reverse Juliet sleeves. And here is my second bodice, complete with the optional Peter Pan collar and the short cuffed sleeves. Now we are going to be constructing the single skirt placket. However, if the skirt with the optional underskirt is being sewn, you can skip ahead to the construction of that using the timestamps down below. For those of you who are making the single skirt though, we are now going to go ahead and construct the placket. So starting out, I have my back main skirt piece here, and we are going to fold that in half widthwise to find the center back. Once folded in half widthwise, we are then going to press to create a crease. Then unfold. Now on the correct side of the skirt, we are going to draw a line down that center back crease that we've just created. It is going to be approximately 3 inches long from this top raw edge. And at the bottom of the line, we are going to draw 2 diagonal lines at a 45-degree angle. Both of these lines should be approximately 1/4 of an inch long. Once you have done that, this is then what that step will look like. So I've drawn a line down that center crease that is approximately 3 inches in length, and then I've drawn 2 diagonal lines at the bottom of that. They are both at a 45-degree angle, and they are 1/4 of an inch in length. Now we are going to carefully cut down the straight center line and then each diagonal line. So once you have done that, now when the fabric is gently opened, it will look like this. Now taking our placket piece, we are going to align the right side of our placket piece to the wrong side of the opening that we've just created on our skirt. So this is my placket facing right sides up, and then I'm going to place my skirt down. So I'm looking at the right side of that fabric as well. Now with those diagonal slits that we've made in that opening, that will now help this skirt to open out in a straight line to now align along that top long raw edge of our placket. Then we are going to pin that in place. It is also normal at this stage to have excess fabric on either side of your placket as well. Once you have then finished pinning your skirt in place to your placket, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to attach that using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure to sew slowly and carefully to avoid getting any pinches in the fabric. Once sewn, we are then going to fold the placket up and press that seam allowance now up towards the placket. Then we are going to fold the top raw edge of the placket by 3/4 of an inch down, wrong sides together, and press. Then we can fold the placket a further 3/4 of an inch, wrong sides together. The folded edge of the placket will now conceal the seam where we joined our placket to our skirt. So we're going to fold that and press it. Once pressed, we can then pin that in place. Once pinned, we can then head to the sewing machine where we can then edge stitch that in place using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have then edge stitched your placket in place, we can then go ahead and trim the excess from each end of the placket. Next, we are going to fold the back skirt in half at the placket, right sides together. So now that our skirt is folded right sides together in half at the placket, the right sides of our placket should now be facing each other, and the short raw top edges should also be aligned. Then we are going to pop a pin in to hold those in place. Next, starting on the left hand bottom corner of the placket where the top stitching is, we are going to sew a 45-degree diagonal line upwards through both layers of the placket, back stitching at both ends. So I have gone ahead and quickly used an air erasable marker just to draw that stitch line to show you exactly where you are going to be sewing. So starting at the left hand bottom corner where our top stitching is, we are going to sew up through both layers of the placket, upwards at a 45-degree angle to the folded end of the placket, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and also the end. It's also very important to make sure that you do not catch the skirt at all in the stitching. So I'm going to go ahead now to sew along the bottom edge of my placket at that 45-degree angle. Once you have then finished stitching, we can now take the pin out at the top of our placket and now place the back skirt with the right side of the fabric facing up towards us. We are going to fold the left side of the placket towards the back of the skirt so that the wrong sides are together, and pop a pin in there to hold that in place towards the back of the skirt. Now we can head to the sewing machine where we are going to baste that in place using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have then basted the left side of your placket in place towards the wrong side of your skirt fabric, then this is now what your placket will look like. So now we are going to be constructing the main skirt. So for those of you who are adding the optional underskirt, then this next step is for your 2 main skirt pieces. And for those of you who are making the single skirt, then we are going to continue on with our back skirt piece that we've already prepared. And then we are going to attach our front skirt piece. So we are going to take our 2 main skirt pieces and place those right sides together, aligning the short raw side edges, and we are going to pin those. Once you have then finished pinning your main front and back skirt pieces together at those short raw side edges, then this is also a great time to also add in any size and care labels as well. So as I mentioned, for those of you who are making the simple skirt, you will have your placket added in the back of your skirt, but the instructions here are the exact same for those of you who are making the optional underskirt version as well. So here is my main skirt pieces for my second Edelweiss dress with the optional underskirt added that we'll be making shortly. So this is my 2 front and back main skirt pieces pinned right sides together, and I've also added in my size and care labels there as well. So now we are going to go ahead and sew those along those short raw side edges now to create our side seams. Then we can also finish off both raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. So once you have then sewn your side seams and you've also finished off those raw edges using either a overlocker or a zigzag stitch, now we are going to finish the bottom raw edge of our skirt once again using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, making sure to not trim off any fabric whilst doing so. Once you have then finished the entire bottom raw edge of your skirt, then we are going to hem the skirt by folding the bottom edge of the skirt over towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1/4 inch and press. You can also go ahead and use the finished edge now as a guide when pressing up that 1/4 inch. I'm just going to flip my skirt around to work with it upside down. So this is the bottom edge of my skirt up here. And I'm going to follow that finished edge as a guide now when pressing up that hem. Once you have then finished pressing up your bottom edge by 1/4 inch, then we are going to fold it a further inch again towards the wrong side of the fabric and press. Once you've then finished folding up your hem by a further inch towards the wrong side of your skirt fabric again, then we are going to pop a few pins in to pin that in place. Then we can head to the sewing machine where we are going to edge stitch the hem in place using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have then finished edge stitching your hem in place, now we are going to move on to the construction of the optional underskirt for those of you who are making that. So now to begin the construction of the optional underskirt. So the underskirt will be constructed in 2 tiers. The top tier will be sewn first, and that consists of 2 underskirt pieces, then followed by the bottom tier, which consists of the remaining 8 underskirt pieces. So firstly, we are going to be working on the top tier. So I have 2 of my underskirt pieces here, and we are going to be placing those wrong sides together, aligning the raw side edges, and we are going to pin those in place. So now once you have your 2 top tier underskirt pieces pinned wrong sides together, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we will now sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we can also finish off those raw edges as well. Now I know that this seems strange that we are putting our top tier underskirt pieces wrong sides together, but this is done to ensure that the garment is fully enclosed without any seams touching the body. If preferred, you can do French seams instead for this step. Once you have then gone ahead and sewn your 2 top tier underskirt pieces together, and you've also finished off those raw edges, then we are going to pop the top tier aside. Now we are going to begin the construction of our bottom tier of the underskirt. So the bottom tier is going to be sewn as a double layer. Each layer is going to consist of 4 underskirt pieces. So to start off with, we are going to be sewing the first layer of the bottom tier. And this layer is going to be on top and therefore most visible. The second bottom tier layer will then be underneath and less visible. So to start the construction of the first layer of our bottom tier, we are going to start with one of our underskirt pieces. We are then going to place a second one on top, right sides together this time. And we are going to be aligning them at one of the short raw ends and pinning. So now once we have those 2 pieces pinned at one of the short raw ends, we are going to open up that second bottom tier piece and fold it back on itself. So we are now looking at the right side of that second bottom tier piece. We are then going to add our third bottom tier piece, right sides together with that second one, aligning them at the short raw edges and pinning. Then we are going to open out that third bottom tier piece back on itself. So once again, we're looking at the right side of that one now. Then place our fourth and final bottom tier piece for that first layer. Right sides together with the third piece, aligning the short raw edges and pinning. And then now at the opposite end of that fourth piece, where we have the open raw edge, we are now going to align that with the open short raw edge on our first piece. Right sides together again and pin. So now we have pinned our 4 bottom tier pieces together for the first layer, and that now makes one continuous loop of fabric. So we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew where we have pinned. Then we can also finish off all 4 of those raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you've then sewn all 4 of your bottom tier pieces together for your top layer, and you've also finished off those raw edges, then we are going to press those seams towards one side. Once you have then finished pressing those seams towards one side, we are now going to head to the sewing machine, where we are going to finish the bottom raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, making sure to not trim off any fabric whilst doing so. Once you have then finished the bottom raw edge of your bottom tier skirt piece using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then we are going to begin the hemming process. We are now going to fold the bottom raw edge up by 1/4 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and press, using the finished edge now as a guide. Once you've then finished pressing up that 1/4 inch, we are going to fold that now a further 1/4 inch and press again. Once you have then finished pressing up your hem by a further 1/4 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to edge stitch that hem in place. So once you have then finished edge stitching your hem in place, we are now going to head back to the sewing machine, where we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of our bottom tier piece. The first row will be 1/4 inch from the top raw edge, then the second row will be 3/8 inch from the first line of stitching. Once you have then sewn your 2 rows of gathering stitches along the entire top raw edge of your bottom tier top layer, then we are going to find the center point of each individual section of the bottom tier underskirt. So to do this, we are going to find the center point between 2 seams and mark that with either a pin or an air erasable sewing marker along the top raw edge. So in total, there will be 4 center parts. So I'm going to just align side seam to side seam, then mark that center point with a pin, then continue on to find the 3 remaining side points. Then you will have all 4 center points marked. Once you've done that, you can then locate the remaining 4 underskirt pieces and repeat those same steps to now create the second layer of the bottom tier of the underskirt. Once you've repeated all of those steps for your second bottom tier piece as well, then we can now pop both of the bottom tier pieces aside. Now working on our top tier again and making sure that it is turned right side out, and just remember that the seams will be on the outside, so on the right side of your fabric for your top tier. We are going to mark the center back and front for the underskirt top tier along the bottom raw edge using either pins or a removable sewing marker again. Once you've found the 2 center points of your top tier, we are now going to bring back one of our bottom tier pieces, and we are then going to gather that first bottom tier layer to be the same width as our top tier. Once you have then finished gathering one of your bottom tier layers to be the same width as your top tier, we are now going to repeat that for our second bottom tier layer as well. So we are going to place the underskirt first bottom tier layer This will be the layer that will be fully visible once the underskirt is completed. Over the top tier, correct sides together. We are going to start by aligning the bottom raw edge of the underskirt top tier with the gathered top raw edge of the underskirt first bottom tier layer. Now we are going to start by matching one of the marked center points of the underskirt bottom tier with one of the underskirt top tier side seams and pinning in place. We are then going to continue by aligning the next center point on our bottom tier with one of the center points on our top tier. The next center point on our bottom tier will then be aligned and pinned to the second side seam on our top tier. And then the last center point on our bottom tier will be pinned and aligned with the last remaining center point on our top tier. Once you have these 4 points pinned, you can then continue to distribute the gathers evenly between those points and continue pinning the first underskirt to the top tier. Once you have then finished distributing those gathers evenly between those 4 points and you've continued pinning your bottom tier top layer to your top tier, then we can head to the sewing machine using a basting stitch and a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to now baste our bottom tier top layer in place to our top tier. Once you have then basted your bottom tier top layer in place to the bottom raw edge of your top tier, we are now going to turn our skirt out. So we are now looking at the wrong side of our top tier, and it is very important to make sure that we still have either our pins or our marks with an air erasable marker in place at the center front and also the center back of those top tier pieces. Now we are going to take our second layer of the underskirt bottom tier, and this is now going to be placed over the underskirt top tier, wrong sides together, aligning the top raw edge of our bottom tier with the bottom raw edge of our top tier. So now our underskirt top tier is now actually going to be sandwiched between our bottom tier second layer and bottom tier top layer. So now we are going to start by matching one of the marked center points of the underskirt second bottom tier layer with one of the underskirt top tier side seams and pin in place. Then we are going to continue by aligning and pinning the next center point on our bottom tier to the first center point on our top tier. Then moving along to the next center point on our bottom tier and aligning and pinning that with our second side seam on our top tier. Then lastly, we'll be finding that last center point on our bottom tier and aligning and pinning that with the last center point on our top tier. Once these 4 main points have been pinned, we can then continue by distributing and pinning the remainder of the underskirt bottom tier second layer to the underskirt top layer. Once you've now finished pinning your second bottom tier in place to your top tier, now sandwiching that between your second and first bottom tier layers. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, being careful to ensure that the bottom tier layers are sitting nicely whilst sewing. Then we are going to be finishing off the raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished attaching your second bottom layer and you've also finished off that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then we are going to turn the underskirt right side out. You can then go ahead at this stage and also remove any visible gathering stitches. Then we are going to gently press the underskirt bottom tiers so that the seam allowance is now pressed downwards and is sandwiched between the 2 bottom tier layers. Once you've then finished pressing, that seam allowance will now be pushed down between your two bottom tier layers. Now we are going to begin the construction of our double skirt placket. So we are going to start by locating our main skirt that we have already prepared, and we are going to ensure that both skirts are turned right side out, remembering that the correct side of the underskirt top tier has the side seams exposed. We are then going to take our main skirt and place it over the underskirt so that the wrong side of the main skirt is touching the correct side of the underskirt. We are then going to align the top raw edges of both skirts as well as match the side seams, ensuring that the corresponding backs and fronts of the skirt are also matched. We are then going to pin the top raw edges of the skirts in place. Once you have then finished pinning both skirts together along that top raw edge, then we are going to turn our skirt over so that we have the right side of our back skirt facing up towards us. Then we are going to find the center back of the skirts by folding them in half widthwise and pressing to create a crease. Then unfold. Once you have then found the center back of the skirt and you've pressed a crease to mark that point, now on the correct side of the main skirt, we are going to draw a line down that center back crease of the skirt, approximately 3 inches in length. Then at the bottom of the line, in the center, we are going to draw 2 diagonal lines, both at a 45-degree angle, and both of these lines should be 1/4 inch in length. This is then what that line will look like once that has been drawn. So that is approximately 3 inches in length down that center back crease. Then I have drawn 2 diagonal lines off from the bottom, both at a 45-degree angle, and they are both 1/4 inch in length. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine using 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew a basting stitch through both of the back skirt layers around those lines that we have drawn. This will then now hold the back skirts together nicely whilst the placket is being constructed in the next steps. Once you have then finished stitching down either side of that line, this is now what that will look like. So I've just used a contrasting thread to hopefully help see it a little bit better on camera. So I've just sewn down one side, down the bottom, and then back up the other, using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we are going to carefully cut through both back skirts down the straight center line that we have drawn in, and then down both diagonal lines. Then once cut, once the fabric is gently opened, it will look like so. Now we are going to take our placket piece and we are going to align the correct side of the placket piece to the wrong side of the underskirt, keeping in mind that the wrong side of the underskirt is the right side of the fabric, and we are aligning the top raw edge of our placket with the opening that we've just created on our skirt, and those 2 diagonal slits will now allow the skirt to open out into a straight line. Once aligned, we are then going to pin that in place. It is also normal at this stage to have a bit of excess fabric on both sides of the placket as well. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to sew slowly and carefully to avoid getting pinches in the fabric. Once sewn, we can then fold the placket up and then press that seam allowance now up towards the placket. Then we are going to fold the top raw edge of the placket 3/4 of an inch down towards the skirt, wrong sides together. Then we are going to fold it a further 3/4 of an inch, wrong sides together again. The folded edge of the placket will now conceal the seam where we attach the placket to the skirt. So we're going to press that in place. Then pin. Now we can head to the sewing machine where we are going to edge stitch that in place using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have then finished edge stitching your placket in place, then we are going to trim the excess from each end of the placket. You can also go ahead and remove any visible basting stitches from where the skirt layers were basted together if needed. Now we are going to fold the back skirt in half at the placket so the skirt sections are right sides together. So I've just turned my skirt inside out, so my back main skirt is now facing right sides together. We are also going to be aligning the short raw top ends of the placket together, and you can pop a pin in there. Now, starting at the left-hand bottom corner of the placket where the top stitching is, we are going to sew a 45-degree diagonal line upwards through both layers of the placket, making sure to backstitch at both ends. So I've just gone ahead and used an erasable marker to show you exactly where that line of stitching is going to be. So it's beginning here at the left-hand bottom corner of our placket where the top stitching is, and we're going to be sewing upwards through both layers of the placket at a 45-degree angle. It is also really important here to make sure that you do not catch the skirts in the stitching whilst doing this step. Once you have then finished stitching up through both layers of your placket, we are then going to turn our skirt out the right way. Now that we are looking at the correct side of our skirt, you can now go ahead and also remove that pin from your placket. Then we are going to fold the left hand side of the placket towards the back of the skirt, wrong sides together, and we're going to pin that in place. Then we can head to the sewing machine again using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and a basting stitch to now baste the left hand side placket in place towards the back of the skirts. Once you have then basted your left hand side placket in place towards the wrong side of the skirt, then you are now looking at your completed skirt with the optional underskirt added. Now we are going to be gathering and attaching our skirts to our bodices. For the purpose of the tutorial, I'm going to be showing the following steps on the skirt with the optional underskirt. However, the instructions will be the same no matter what skirt version you are making. So we are going to start off by sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along the entire top raw edge of our skirts from one side of the placket to the other. The first row of stitching will be a 1/4 of an inch from the top raw edge. Then the second row will be 3/8 of an inch away from that first row of stitching. If the underskirt version is being sewn, the gathering stitches will be sewn through both main skirt and underskirt simultaneously. You must ensure that the top raw edges of both are accurately aligned and still pinned in place. I have just finished sewing my 2 rows of gathering stitches along the entire top raw edge of my skirt. So as I mentioned, for those of you who are also sewing the optional underskirt, you would have now sewn through both your main and your underskirt layers simultaneously. And for those of you who are making this simple skirt, you will simply have just sewn your 2 rows of gathering stitches through your single layer of fabric. For the purposes of the tutorial, I'm going to continue working with this Edelweiss dress that has the optional underskirt. It also has the reverse Juliet sleeves and the optional sash. However, the following instructions will be the same no matter what version you are making. So now we are going to be gathering our skirt to be the same width as our bodice, making sure to not gather the plackets. If the underskirt option has been sewn, be careful not to pull the gathering stitches too hard, as this will cause them to snap due to the extra bulk created by that extra skirt layer. Once you have then finished gathering your skirt to be the same width as your bodice, we are now going to turn the skirt wrong side facing out. And we are then going to place the bodice inside of the skirt, right sides together. Making sure to align the corresponding front and back bodices with the front and back skirts. Then we are going to align the bottom raw edge of the bodice with the top raw edge of the skirts, matching the side seams of the skirts to the side seams of the bodice, and pinning. Then I like to pin the back of the skirt where the placket is to the centre back of my bodices. Once pinned at those points, we are then going to distribute the gathers evenly and continue pinning our skirt to our bodice. Make sure that if the optional sash has been added, that it is moved well out of the way to avoid being accidentally caught in this seam. Once you have then finished distributing those gathers evenly and you've pinned your skirt to your bodice, right sides together, once again make sure that if you have added the optional sash, that is kept well out of the way. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew where we have pinned. We can then also finish off that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then attached your skirt to your bodice and you've also finished that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, you can then go ahead and remove any visible gathering stitches. Now we are going to turn our dress right side out. And then we are going to press that seam allowance now up towards the bodice. Once you have then finished pressing the seam allowance up towards your bodice, now we are going to head to the sewing machine again, where we are now going to top stitch that seam allowance in place using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. If the optional sash has been added, just ensure that that is kept out of the way whilst top stitching. Once you have then finished top stitching that seam up in place towards your bodice, now we are going to go ahead and attach our buttons. Now, using the buttonholes already created on the left side of our back bodice as a guide, we are going to now mark the corresponding button placement on the right hand side of the back bodice. So I've just gone ahead using my buttonholes created on my left back bodice piece to mark out where my buttons will be placed on my right back bodice piece. So I've just placed those marks using some pins. Now we're going to go ahead and attach our buttons to our right back bodice piece. As I have mentioned previously though, snaps can be used though if you do prefer. So I'm going to go ahead now and attach my buttons, keeping in mind that Edelweiss is designed to have a 3/4 of an inch button placket overlap. Once you have then attached your buttons to your right back bodice piece, then you are now looking at your completed Edelweiss dress. Now, if you have added the optional sash, I will link a separate video down below on how to tie the perfect sash bow. But that is now everything for the Edelweiss sew along. So I have my first Edelweiss here with the optional scalloped collar, sash, and also the underskirt, as well as the reverse Juliet sleeves. And then I have my second Edelweiss completed as well. This one has the optional Peter Pan collar and also the simple cuffed sleeves. Congratulations on now completing your beautiful Edelweiss dress. I hope that you have enjoyed sewing along with me today. If you have, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for all future sew along videos. If you would like to join a sew along in real time, you can actually join our Sew Along with Peony Patterns Facebook group that I will link down below. This is where you can actually join our sew alongs with us in real time. So we actually split the construction up over a matter of days to sew each step side by side, and there are always amazing prizes to also be won. You can also join our main Peony Patterns Facebook group as well, that I will also link down below. This is where you can then share any of your makes using patterns by Peony Patterns, and you can also ask any questions that you may have. But that is now all for today, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon for another sew along.